Welcome back, Andrew.
Hi there.
And we have Felix too. Wonderful. Thank you all for your presentations today. It's been really delicious and so inspiring. I want to start by bringing in this question of timing and rhythm. Many of the questions that are in kind of could be synthesized as just addressing the significance of whether it's timing of the natal chart, whether it's timing of, the 8 or the, what did you say, Andrew, the 9 hours that I need to stir that particular compound, or Matthias talking about the timing of the year. So maybe each of you can talk about the significance of rhythm and timing as it relates to your practice. Maybe let's start with Felix.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you again for having me on. Yeah, as it pertains to timing, I think the timing is absolutely critical. Within the context of what I was talking about earlier within Aurelian medicine and ens astrale, I noticed that in the comments there was a question particularly about why do we take the time of birth as opposed to the time of conception for astrology when we're taking a look at the natal chart. The reason that I have been able to validate over here using intrinsic data field investigations is because when a child is born and takes their first breath, breath is spirit. Respirare, to re-imbue with spirit.
Totally.
This is where spirit enters into the body. Before that, the soul is already forming. It's in its infancy inside of the womb, and the body also in its infancy. So we have soul and body there, which is to say sulfur and salt. But spirit, Mercury, doesn't enter until the first moment of breath, and that happens at the moment of birth, not at conception. Until that time, the amount of spirit that is inside of the individual is technically the spirit of the mother and the oxygenation coming through the blood. So this is why we take a look at that particular thing. But as it pertains to timing, we have this term in astrology that's called decumbiture. And decumbiture is the moment that a person takes to their sickbed. That's literally the definition of that. And when somebody takes the time and date that they go to their sickbed or that they come down with symptoms, this helps us from the medical astrology perspective take a look in comparison to the natal chart and find out what types of influences could be going on. And aside from that, as we mentioned with ens naturale, the different times of the year have different elemental associations that correspond to them, whether we're looking at this from a Vedic perspective, especially within Ayurvedic medicine is very, very common with this, but we also see it within TCM, we see it within Galenic medicine, etc. That the time of year really determines what types of elemental forces are at play and where they're at play inside of the body. And so we need to really take a look at that and keep all of that into consideration, because one particular diet all year long is not going to be ideally healthy for the individual. We have to eat kind of with the seasons and what is available to us and what we've preserved and so on and so forth. And all of these things really need to be taken into consideration massively if we want to look at things from a multidimensional kind of holistic health perspective. So anyway, I'll pass the torch to whomever's next.
Yeah, that makes sense. Andrew, maybe you had spoken a little bit about how the Rasa Shastra really had this timing element and the astrological element too. Could you help us understand a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so you'll be given for particular raw materials, they'll say when's a good time to harvest it. So they'll give you a particular moon cycle or a particular time of the year or a season, or just something like that to just give you a clue when it's most likely to be beneficial. But obviously you've got the weather factor as well. So one of the great things about Rasa was you prepare it in the summer when the weather was good, and you put it in your bag. There's no sell-by date on it. So basically you go about your business, you travel to your villages and dispense, there's no need to, you don't have to worry about collecting herbal components so much, because everything's obviously, there's no, there's no sell-by date on it. As regards to preparing, I think it's probably more significant. We tend to obviously there are limitations, but within those limitations, you can do like I'm not sure the Western term. I think it's like is it electional, but it's Muhurta in Jyotish. So we'll look at the coming months, next to maybe 2 or 3 months, and see when's an auspicious time, and that's kind of based more on moon position rather than planets. But obviously, if you're doing gemstones, there's a gemstone connection between the sort of 9 gems, the Navaratna and the planets, and the 9 metals and the planet. So that would be significant. You try to just get as much right as you can, so you've got as many things going for you as possible. It's like I wouldn't not do it if the astrology was bad, but it was good for me for that at that time. I'm in the UK. You only get 3 months a year here to do anything, but the rest of the time it's raining. So I'm a little bit restrictive in the time I can do it, but I'd still look within that cycle and see if there was a window that would be more beneficial. So that's kind of the. In India, slightly different. I mean, they have their 6 seasons, so they've got more scope, and certainly, let's say like Panchakarma, it would always be done towards the autumn. In the kind of Vata period. That's the sort of when energy's moving, it's easier to dispel stuff. So it depends on. Yeah, it depends on what you're doing and what your approach to it is. Everybody's got a different approach, but if you read the old text, it will say this particular stone, if it's like a moonstone, is Kakata or something under the moon in Cancer in its own sign, something like that would be really good. And Mrigashira is very good for Rasayana, because that's the period when in the mythologies, when the gods and demons were at war, they were fighting under a Mrigashira moon, and they were searching for the elixir of immortality. So now that nakshatra is always to do with rejuvenation and stuff like that. So there's a lot of scope. I mean, it's a nice element to bring in. Probably practically in India, it's done less. But if you speak to all the doctors, they're all wearing a Navaratna ring. They all know their birthday. And if you tell them anything about astrology, the first thing they do is hold their hand out for you and expect you to tell them about their life.
I'm curious, forgive my ignorance of the Vedic astrology, but I know in Western astrology, there's such a big difference between tropical, and sidereal. And I'm wondering, is that a factor in Vedic astrology? Do they consider that the transition, the movement from Copernican times to now?
Well, they're just working with a sidereal chart. It's a fix. So, but
okay, so they do sidereal.
Yeah. So, but within that also, they have where do you decide where the starting point is? So there's a couple of different starting points in India. So some people say it should be fixed to Revati, and some people say it should be fixed to the star Chitra. So there's a difference of about 3 degrees between those two. So prior to 1955, when the government standardized it, more people were using Revati. Now people, it's commonplace if you're learning astrology now, they'll teach you that the Chitra Ainamsha is the right one. But I mean, if you go down into the divisional charts, it starts to get wildly different. So even within that school of thought, there's
equal houses, fixed houses.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense to me to fix it to a star, because otherwise you're just drawing a circle on the wall and saying, well, where does it start? But if you can seems arbitrary and say that's where it starts, then that makes more sense to me.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you for that elaboration. And Matthias, a lot of what what I know my dad has talked about and what you shared is this idea of building an organ of perception. Is there a practice or something where people could build an organ of time and rhythm perception that would allow them to feel more connected to these rhythms and timings?
Well, kind of what I was sharing earlier about this art within how you recognize the inner pictures given to us by a certain phenomena in nature, and then hold them long enough in time before they start to yield things in their relationships to, let's say, a plant or mineral or animal. In itself, it's kind of a rhythm.
Right. That makes sense. So it's not necessarily like a week-long practice. This would be a practice that goes throughout the year with that plant, and that would be building that organ of perception.
I think I could just, probably point out something that that it's not in particular the content of the images that is of importance. When you're doing it is in terms of the day or in your own, I guess, rhythmic way. But what is truly important is really the exertion of the soul. That is what's really crucial. When I am forming an inner picture, I am willing my thinking out of my own forces to form an imagination. But then how I connect that inner image to a feeling, how I will my feeling to connect to this image that I have is then the next level, because then you're translating that image now into a symbol.
Right.
And then that symbol lives within how it lives within your life. And then sometimes as you're carrying it, something approaches you in the world that gives you kind of a next kind of message. And paying attention to when that is happening usually begins a node within your timing and rhythmic research. It's the
Right.
best way I can put it.
Yeah, that makes
And then you
perfect
keep
sense.
following that through,
Yeah.
because one of the things with working with rhythm that I understand, and I'll use a man's work named Edward Lawrence, who was trying to do research and connecting how the Mars cycle is connected to an oak tree. And he went to great lengths to even devise these little tiny cameras to track the contraction and expansion of the buds of the tree and try to correlate that to different occultations or squares or oppositions within Mars. And right away he found there was quite a lot of connection. And the next year he replicated the experiment and it wasn't so. And then kept repeating it. Then he found, okay, it's not just exactly this rhythm. There was actually a whole nother long 12-year cycle in that. And then when he repeated that, he realized there's a whole nother cycle in it, to then basically ends up saying, I wish I had 30 more years to study this one.
Yeah, right.
Because it just is very multifaceted. But what's
Yeah, layers
important
on
is
layers.
the stretching and developing of your soul while in the research of that rhythm that the
Yeah.
spiritual world really resonates with and can pour into you what it needs.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And that kind of leads into another sort of set of questions were around how do we diagnose? Like what are the tools we use to diagnose? And I think the development of this kind of capacity is in a way that. So maybe Felix, you could share a little bit about, you shared these wonderful sort of frameworks that can be used to think about all these different structures. And I know Saja kind of shared the same sort of layering. Is there a practice you have for diagnosing things?
Yeah, well, again, legally, we have to be extremely careful about the term diagnose. So for legal purposes, I'm going to amend that to analyzing or investigating. That
Yeah.
being said, within the framework of Aurelian medicine, what I use is a piece of intrinsic data field analysis equipment known as the SE5 2000. And this is something that allows me to be at great distance, even to a lot of the clients, and to be able to inquire into the causal structure of that individual. And because the causal structure has a repository of all of the electromagnetic, etheric, physical, and spiritual material of that individual, that's primarily the way that I'm able to work with clients all over the world. And I find that I'm able to test, like, for instance, I can search for the intrinsic data field signature of a particular chemical or a molecule or whatever else within a plant utilizing this technology. In the same way that if, let's say, somebody wasn't absorbing a nutrient that I was able to find was deficient, I'd be able to go into, say, the gastric parietal cells and see if they are secreting the right amount of gastric acid or intrinsic factor, or et cetera, et cetera. So, intrinsic data fields are holographic and fractal information, preformative causal packages that are able to tell us infinite amounts of information. And so that has come to be my favorite tool. But I also use, if somebody's seeing me, I use wrist analysis. I'm trained in both Ayurvedic tradition of pulse analysis as well as in Chinese medicine and Taoist tradition. I'm also able to use tongue analysis, sclerosis, being able to check, it's called sclerology rather than sclerosis, being able to check the whites of the eyes, and iridology, checking out the irises and the pupils, skin diagnostics, just a wide different range of things, including, of course, the astrological thing. But as it comes to toxicology, we have to rely on a few different things. Either I can utilize my SE5 2000 intrinsic data field software, or we can do hair analysis tests to be able to see about the presence of heavy metals or perhaps other different toxins. But sometimes those things are limited, right? Like, I can't always take a biopsy of somebody's liver if I want to see if a certain type of intratissue toxin exists. So I either have to throw something at it that's going to work, or utilize a tool like I have with the intrinsic data field analysis. And that seems to be the thing that I rely on the most these days.
Yeah, fascinating, interesting. So, speaking to Andrew, in a way, you were talking about doing analysis, getting remedies from the pharmacy and taking them both to a lab to kind of check out that way. Do you have other ways of testing efficacy? Is it, just looking at the response in your own body? Are there other methods that you use to look at what you're producing?
Yeah, I mean, you're given a set of qualities that you can check just to see. I mean, are you talking about when you've actually prepared it to see if it fulfills the criteria? So things like just touch, taste, how does it react if it's put back in a flame? Is there any smoke visible? Does it visibly fit between the fingerprints with ease? Does it feel
the size of the grind? Yeah. Right.
They're all kind of very, the body has become the sort of testing mechanism, really. Does it follow a prescribed, I mean, the color patterning? So at a certain stage, does it reach the right kind of color? So most bashma are kind of a reddish brown or a gray color. But if it came out a very weird sort of silvery, if it was shiny, all these things would be something would be amiss. And sometimes if something's not been prepared correctly, you can put it into milk, or you can float it on milk just to see what it does. It can cause a reaction. So some of the metallics, if they're not prepared properly, if you sprinkle them on things like a sour, like a yogurt or something, a discolor, particularly like copper, you'll get like a greenish hue and things like that. So there's lots of tests that you can do just to sort of make sure that it's looking right. You kind of get a feeling after you've done about 6 or 7 cooks, you kind of get an idea whether it's going in the right direction or not. I mean, I say most of the stuff I've prepared has been okay. I've had the odd batch which has gone wrong. And that's usually because, I tell you, it usually goes wrong because I do a demonstration and people like to see the whole thing. They want to leave at the end of the day to know that they've seen the whole process. So I'll quite often skip something just to get to the end to show them what it would look like. And of course, I put that in a jar, not label it properly, and leave it on the shelf. And of course, I come back to do another test and I see it up there and I think, oh, that's all right. I'd already processed that. So I bring it down. And of course, immediately you think, well, that shouldn't do that. And then I remember, oh yeah, that's a batch that I missed out a procedure. So it does work if you stick to the method and you follow it through. Yeah, I mean, you can generally, if something's not right, you can sense it. I mean, like particularly the toxic plants, if they haven't been prepared properly, just dabbing it on the tongue, and you can feel like a numbing sensation or something doesn't feel right. But it's not really a huge problem. In all the years I've even working in the pharmacy and stuff I've done myself, I haven't really come across too many cases of being a problem. Where it is a problem, it's sort of made headlining news. I know there was a guy who was a doctor in the States about 10 years ago, and he went into a Ayurvedic pharmacy and he got a lot of medicines and he tested them. There was kind of world headlines about how they're all toxic. But of course, he was testing all Rasa medicines. So he said, I found copper in this one, and I found I found tin in this one, and well, that's what's in them. That's the ingredient. So, yeah.
Yeah, hard to
Well,
say
and
there.
about that really fast, I mean, it's like Paracelsus had mentioned in the West in the 1500s, because he was using prepared sublimated mercury sulfide, mercury sulfide as well, specifically in the treatment of syphilis. And a lot of his naysayers would say, like, oh, you're applying something that is toxic to the individual. You're going to create this negative effect in them, even if only long term. His response to that was, it's the dose that determines whether something is a medicine or a poison. And, Ayurveda and definitely the Rasa Shastra tradition keeps that very close in tabs. So, yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, that's kind of what the BD preps are about. It's like, or homeopathy. It's like, it's such a small, just this hint of a signature that's really kind of to say, can we tip it in the right direction? And I love that the Rasa Shastra really has this, it's so grounded in the basic fundamental simple principles that it's available to the part of the world where they're not going to have the lab, And so still at that point, it's done in such a way where you're not creating problems, because it does have the process is what allows that to be safe. And
and they have
beautiful.
there's like a good tradition as well of, there's lots of remedies for all these as well, and quite often the remedies will actually be the purification itself. So for instance, like arsenic, you purify it using ash pumpkin. But if you take ash pumpkin juice with a little bit of sugar, that's the remedy for the arsenic poisoning. So it kind of cuts both ways. There's a kind of, and like goat's milk was a general for any kind of intoxication. They have a whole protocol for, in case the patient gets poisoned or you don't prepare it properly. I mean, hopefully you don't you don't need to test that. But there are protocols, quite long protocols for that as well. And just, in terms of sort of diagnosis and treatment plans, they have this great tripod of treatment. They say if the three pillars are there, then the treatment would be successful. So basically you need a good physician, somebody who can actually understand what's going wrong. You need a good medicine that should be well made, but most importantly, you need a good patient. If the patient doesn't listen to what you tell them, it's a hopeless case.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, I know there's a definition of placebo that kind of riffs off of that a little bit, which is like the physician has to be trusted. So the patient has to trust the physician. They have to understand and trust the diagnosis. And then they have to trust that the physician is applying the appropriate remedy. And when those three things come together, it can be a sugar pill, but healing happens because the patient is involved in a way enough to say, yeah, I'm on board. Yeah, interesting. Huh.
Yeah, there's some funny little bits, and like in the Charaka classic, there's some really strange stuff in there. And one of them, it's quite funny. I mean, there's even a treatment protocol in there for elephants. So if you ever want to treat an elephant, it'll tell you how to do it. It says something like, these are no-nos. If the patient comes and it displays any of these characteristics, then you just don't treat them. So number one, they've got no faith in God. They don't believe in God, they're like atheistic. If they think they know more about you than the treatment, or if they can't turn up on time, if they can't get their affairs in order, make sure you don't treat them. I mean, it's all these kind of...
Obviously learned from hard experience, right? Yeah, wow. So there's a few questions here about applying these things in a contemporary reality where we're having things like new illnesses coming out of labs, with what do they call it? Gain of function research. There's questions about whether COVID was something like that, or the fact that we're living now in these really complex energetic fields with a lot more coherent EMFs instead of just the sort of incoherent natural EMFs of the earth. Are there ways that these practices can start to address these new challenges that our multi-layered bodies are dealing with? Anyone's welcome. I mean, I know Matthias is kind of sharing that as starting with healing community. Like, how can we strengthen the being of community so that we're able to be supported in that? Anyone feel free to jump in.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'll hop right in. Yeah, for me, this is a huge thing. In fact, between the time that I hopped off about 3/4 of the way through Andrew's presentation until I hopped back on for this Q&A, I was actually just dealing with a client, and I was explaining to her that in up to the 1820s, there were about 70 common toxins that would have been present at that time to just about any human organism, and a lot of those were heavy metal or heavy element or radioactive element types of exposures, in addition to perhaps some protozoa and a few parasites, bacterial infections, things like that. They were not really that large. They weren't that huge. Right now, the experts, chemical experts, think that there's anywhere between 5 to 12,000, possibly more, forever chemicals alone, which are PFOA substances or PFAS substances, polyfluorinated substances, I guess we could call them, or polyfluorinated acids. And so we're working at an exponential scale of toxicity in the present day. Just the realm of ens veneni alone within the context of Aurelian medicine has to take into account all of those toxins and how do we work with them. And a huge thing that we're doing over here is creating clinical studies to be able to see, like, okay, certain PFAS or PFOAs, other different types of things that people, forever chemicals that people are exposed to. First of all, what types of endocrine disruption or nervous system disruption or different types of symptomatic effects do they have as a result of these toxicities? And then what types of treatments do we have to be able to eliminate those toxicities from the body? And does that always correspond with the elimination of the symptom? That's a difficult thing because we have so many mutagens now, things that are actually changing the genetic structure, which, again, prior to 1820, we really didn't see a whole lot of. Things like radioactivity we did, but again, radioactive mining for uranium and other things like this was not a common practice. Sometimes people would have accidentally found these things or, set up shop on top of a radioactive hotbed, but it wasn't being actively sought after. So what I've had to do within my approach is to completely update and modernize the pharmacopoeia and the studies of the existing pharmacopoeia to see, does this actually work for this thing, especially as we were talking about with stray electromagnetics or coherent electromagnetic fields. We definitely have to take a look at what are the solutions to being able to protect it against this. I found that copper, and of course, Andrew, I'm sure will know quite a bit about this. Copper is used pretty ubiquitously in India, and has been for an exceptionally long time for the purification of water. In fact, it's still considered to be one of the best ways for gentry in rural villages to be able to purify water, is pouring it into copper initially. But if you twist it in certain ways and cut it at certain lengths, it will actually be able to structure the electromagnetic fields of things. And so we find ourselves having to go back through different ancient systems of measurement and different systems that they would have used, and seeing, do these types of things also have applications in the modern world as well? And then things that don't, we have to be pioneers and we have to try and find what things do work. Like, for instance, colloidal zeolite is an absolutely wonderful material that is able to bind to a tremendous amount of toxins inside of the body and effortlessly get rid of them. So yeah, there's lots of different types of approaches like that, but yeah, it's expanded so much, our realm of toxicity. The keyboards that we're touching on, the vinyl blinds that the sun hits. I mean, we are exposed to so many toxins innocuously. When people wear artificial clothing like polyester or acrylic clothing and things like this, all of these things are touching your skin and getting into, especially when
It's got a little bit of a slow internet connection coming through. Hopefully he can reconnect. I'll keep my eye on the attendees and bring them in when we can. So yeah, so just that bigger question of, how do we deal with contemporary challenges around this healing principle? Looks like he's come back in. Oh, there he comes.
All right.
There we go. Yeah, so just the bringing that back into, how do we focus on testing new remedies or applying it to new things? One of the elements I often consider is the fact that all of those things combining, a lot of the research that's done for pharmaceutical products is like that item in isolation in a petri dish. And it's like, okay, but that particular human being in this whole blend of its life with the other medications they're taking, like, can we look at that? And it's just not looked at. So that's a bigger part of the challenge.
Yeah. Going from in vitro to in vivo is a huge thing, and not just in animal model studies either, because there are differences between, a marsupial organism versus a rodent organism versus a human organism, even though they're all mammalian. So it's very important to be able to take a look at how each different species actually might respond to certain things. And a lot of that comes down to the microbiome too, in a lot of cases, at least for consumed materials. We really have to dive in and incorporate that massively into our understanding, because rats eat styrofoam and plastic all the time, but they also have certain parasites inside of their gut that are able to help to break down a lot of those plastic toxicities, whereas we do not have those same things inside of our digestive microbiome. In fact, they would be very adverse to our health. So yeah, what you say has a lot of validity there, Ben.
Yeah, it's a complex world we're living in now, and not quite so simple anymore. I'm looking through the questions here and seeking for ones that kind of bridge what we're speaking about, because some of them are a little bit more specific to an individual. Let's see here. Yeah, so there's a bunch we've addressed. Yeah. So someone, maybe we'll just do a little bit of popcorn here for the last few minutes, one-off questions we can just kind of pop through. Someone is asking Andrew about administering ghee for tinnitus. You talked about using that as a remedy. What would that look like?
Using it for what? Sorry, what did you say?
Ghee for tinnitus.
Oh yeah. So yeah, like warm sesame oil or ghee, warm ghee into the ear. So obviously lie down on one side and you just put a few drops in the warm ghee and just let it do its job really, and then just wipe out the excess, and gradually over time the oil will solidify and you can take it out with a bud or something. But just the natural property of the ghee is to sort of pull the sort of vata, the air element out. I mean, because of the hearing sense is easily disturbed by vata, because of a sort of space, akasha and vata are all the same thing. So we tend to get hearing disturbance, even vertigo. If you get lots of like sudden vertigo, that kind of thing can be very useful for that. And then that's when you would maybe look at something like a medicinal ghee as well to give it a bit of extra oomph. So you could do like a triphala ghee or a Brahmi ghee or something like that. Brahmi is quite good because it goes to the head anyway, so it's kind of like a double. It's like a double, double action there. So yeah,
Dashamula as well, right? Dashamula.
Not, I wouldn't use that one so much for head. That would be more kind of like digestive stuff, like more central pathway. I would use that for.
Interesting. I've successfully used Dashamula oil internally in the ear to treat tinnitus several times. So that's within Ayurveda, that's what I was taught. So interesting to hear that you wouldn't use that. So you would use
I didn't say I wouldn't use it. I just say it wouldn't be on my top 10. But if it's work, then great.
Cool.
Interesting. So many ways of interpreting these things. And maybe this can lead to a question. You had mentioned Felix about split testing. So there were some questions. What does that look like? So how can we understand the efficacy of our things using some more of these contemporary scientific practices?
Yeah, totally. So, if I remember right, one of the questions is, can you describe what split testing is? So, split testing is basically where you would take one particular procedure and a set of materials, and you would split it up into as many different ways as you can think of, trying to keep the controls and the variables in mind. So, like for instance, when I was taught how to make spagyric tinctures initially, some of the best information that existed at that time was to take a ground herb in the quantity of one finger through the volumetric material that you're using, usually like a mason jar or something. One finger needs to be one finger width should be the herb, and then you go 3 or 4 finger widths of your alcohol, say, over the top of that. Um, that's not very precise. And so one of the things I would do is I would actually test out a fresh material and then split test that against a dried material. Then I would take a pre-powdered material versus a material that is still more intact. And then once I had answers based on should it be fresh or should it be, left in its whole state versus powdered state, and what the best result of that was, then I would move on and I'd split test it again. It's like, okay, I should use a whole state. Should I use this much or should I use this much? And I'd break it out of volumetric quantities, and I would put it into, a sense of metrics like grams, for instance, so that I'd be able to see what is the precise amount of grams that would be better. Is it, 15 grams? Is it 20 grams? Is it 30 grams? And do the same experiment about throughout from the beginning until the end, about 70 to 150 different ways, and be able to test the most efficient things. And what we find is not a straightforward answer, but rather subjective answers in what are we using this remedy for in the first place. Because in certain cases, drop dose, we may need a much higher concentration of something, whereas with if we want to apply this regularly with meals, we may need a slightly lower dosage or something like that. It's totally subjective to what it is that we're studying, the item of pharmacopoeia, et cetera. But that's the basis behind split testing, is being able to do something as many different ways as you possibly can, just one thing as many different ways. And I have worked now with well over 1,000 different herbs and mineral materials and metal materials in my lab, and I'm still split testing tons of things. I have just worked my way through the about 500 different common herbs that people will see throughout Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia, through traditional Chinese medicine pharmacopoeia, and throughout Western herbalism pharmacopoeias, and being able to find what the best ratio is just for a spagyric tincture, which is kind of like the easiest and most simple to produce item of spagyric pharmacopoeia. And not that just because something is simple to produce, does it mean that it's not highly effective. It's that each different item of spagyric pharmacopoeia in particular has an effect on the multidimensional anatomy in either the soul, the spirit, or the body in a different way, and impacts things a different way. So depending on the root causation, which of those entia are really affecting the person, that's how we match the remedy.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. But it's a complex process because there are so many variables. You're both the idea as well as the way it's prepared and the particular constituents of the preparation. And yeah, all of those are a factor.
Yeah, over the
Thank you for
past
elaborating.
17 years, Ben, I think that I have tried over 30,000 split tests that I've documented here in order to even get to the list of those 500 herbs in their best preparation for that one item of pharmacopoeia. So,
wow. Yeah, well, thank you for doing that hard work. And I mean, this is a part of what it means to be an alchemist too, is to have that rigor. This is why, like when Steiner talks about spiritual science, it's not just like, oh, let me have this random imagination, but it's a science. We need to bring that same rigor to it for it to be valid, for it to be something that's repeatable, that people can trust. So yeah, that's a really important part of it. Yeah, wonderful. Well, so we're just about at our time here. And I just want to thank you all so much for bringing your wisdom, sharing your time with us here today, and sharing what we're doing here with your communities. It's so exciting to see everything that's going on here in the chat and in the rooms beyond. So I'm definitely appreciating the potential for future engagements as well. So expect an email from me at some time in the future, fellas, and we'll go from there. So I think with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much again, and blessings on the rest of your day.
Blessings to you too. Thank you so much.
Right. So thank you everyone watching. As I mentioned before, I'll grab these questions that we didn't get to in the Q&A and share them and distribute them to our speakers today. And thank you all for participating, for being here present with us. And let's see if I can bring Joe in too. Yeah, wonderful community, wonderful sharing, lots of interesting opportunities to dive in deeper. I'll post those links again in an email when I send out the video, the ones that we shared today, so that you can dive deeper in as you wish. As I mentioned before, there's a whole list of links down the sidebar in the place where the lectures are. So feel free to explore those links to go deeper, books, websites, other things like that, PDFs for you to take a gander at. Anything else, Joe, that we should touch in on before we wrap up for the day?
No, I think you've covered it all admirably, and looking forward to the final day tomorrow.
Yeah, sweet. Yeah, so tomorrow, just kind of quick into it. It's nature, alchemy, and art. And we have some wonderful presentations that I'm really looking forward to. Stephen Harding, talking about Gaia alchemy, how do we reconnect the psyche and the soul to science. Brian Kotnor, he's an alchemist and artist, touching in on the Emerald Tablet that Patricia mentioned on Friday. Courtney Cosgriff, who's a beekeeper, herbalist, and alchemist, and exploring alchemy of the hive. And then wrapping up with Stuart Lundy, who is a biodynamic farmer and researcher. We recorded ahead of time because he's not able to be here tomorrow. And it's a deep dive into some esoteric elements, into biodynamic, into soul transformation. And I hope you'll stick around for that last one. And then we'll have our final panel and we'll wrap up. I think maybe we'll leave the chat room open for a little bit so that you all can make connections if you'd like to other folks in there. And we'll call it a wrap. So thank you all so much. We will see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific. And I think that's it. Yeah. So have a blessed day, and we'll see you later.